the slide, I should have inserted a little carrot there in front of Montana and said Butte, Montana. I really do want to talk about Senator Wheeler's connections to Butte primarily today. But first I want to thank Kim and Ellen Crane, who I've known for a number of years. When I first started coming to Butte, working on this project, I've been joking, I've been working on it since I was in the 6th grade. So it's been a while, but I really do, I suspect that all of you understand what an incredible resource the Butte Silver Bow Archives is. I hope folks all over Montana recognize what an incredible repository of historical documents and newspapers and city directories and photographs are contained in this building. So a shout out to the Butte Silver Bow Archives for being one of the great, certainly one of the great mining archives anywhere in the world, I think, but a terrific, terrific addition to Montana history and the history of Butte, Montana. Butte, America. I want to talk, as I said, briefly about Senator Wheeler's career, but I want to really relate most of what I have to say today to his connections to Butte, because he would not have been, I think, the character that he turned out to be without his formative years being spent here in Butte, Montana. This was his political base. I don't think there's any question about that. Silver Bow County and Butte. He relied upon substantial margins out of this county and this city as part of his political foundation, if you will, his political base. He came here in 1905, pretty much straight out of college, law school at the University of Michigan. He was looking, according to his own testimony, for a place where he could hang his shingle, his law, and open the law practice. There's a story that may be apocryphal. I didn't include it in the book because I couldn't really prove it, but Wheeler repeated the story throughout his life that he'd gotten off a train here in Butte in 1905, lost his walking around money to a couple of card sharks, and didn't essentially have any additional money to buy a train ticket to go on to Spokane. He's looking for a place where he could practice law. That's how he wound up in Butte. I'm not sure that is really a true story. It's a story that's good enough, it ought to be true, but it may not really be true. He got elected to the state legislature in 1910 from Silver Bow County, served only one term, and came into immediate conflict with the Anaconda Company over all kinds of things, not least being the selection of the United States Senator. At the time that state legislators still selected United States Senators. Wheeler threw in his lot with Tom Walsh from Helena, who eventually became a United States Senator and engineered Wheeler's appointment to become U.S. Attorney in Montana right about the time of the First World War. You all probably know the story as well as I do about what happened in Butte and Montana at large in the summer of 1917, after the United States has entered the war in April of 1917. This guy, Frank Little, comes to Butte. He's an organizer for the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, the one big union, but he's a really radical guy. He makes the case to the mine workers here that they should resist the draft, that they should be very skeptical of the United States becoming involved in a world war, a war that, at least in Little's telling, was essentially an imperialist war to prop up the British Empire. The British Empire, not the most popular thing in Butte, Montana in 1917 with the Irish population here. And of course, Little is abducted in the middle of the night from a boarding house on Wyoming Street, tortured by some armed men who eventually string him up from the railroad trestle just at the outskirts of town. Wheeler is the U.S. Attorney, and up to this point he has been a champion. One of the reasons, frankly, I was attracted to his story was because he was such a champion of civil liberties, the First Amendment, the idea that it's not unpatriotic to dissent against your government when you disagree with something that they're doing. But that all kind of came to a head in that roiling summer of 1917 right here in Butte. Wheeler is really shocked by Frank Little's murder, called it a damnable outrage. And of course, the Anaconda Company, controlling so much of the press in Montana at that point, basically made Wheeler the scapegoat for Little's murder, accusing him as U.S. attorney of essentially aiding and abetting the murder because he had refused to arrest Little for his allegedly seditious talk about opposing the government during a time of war. Wheeler said that he did not agree with much of what Frank Little was saying, but nonetheless he believed that he had the right to say it. We have a First Amendment, and he was operating under the belief that speaking out against the government was not a unpatriotic thing to do, not a grounds for treason, and certainly not grounds for being tortured and executed. Of course, Little's murder was never solved. Wheeler went to his grave believing that agents of the Anaconda Company had indeed facilitated the murder of Frank Little. He sent a report to the Justice Department in this period where he specifically made that allegation. He said it was beyond a doubt that the Anaconda Company had paid these gunmen to abduct Little, and the reason they had done so was to issue a warning to any other radical that this was the fate that could await them if they agitated too much against the war effort. So this is a really pivotal moment, I believe the pivotal moment in Wheeler's development as a politician. He takes away from this an even stronger commitment to civil liberties, to free speech, to the idea of dissent being an honorable thing. And he comes by his anti-war sentiments, I think, also more strongly as a result of these experiences during World War I in Montana. He ultimately loses his job as U.S. Attorney for the controversy that ensued around his handling of or unwillingness to prosecute people for speaking out against the government. But he engineers a remarkable political comeback after losing his job as U.S. Attorney in 1918. He's called before the Montana Council of Defense and grilled on his personal political views, whether he's bought Liberty bonds, what his annual income is, all kinds of, in his view, inappropriate questions to be asking anybody, let alone United States Attorney. But he engineers a remarkable political comeback in 1922 and gets himself elected to the United States Senate for the first of 4 terms. By the early 1930s, he's being grouped with a group of mostly Western progressives under the title as a son of the wild jackass. These were extremely candid, outspoken politicians, believers in a progressive approach to American politics, Republicans and Democrats. This is a time when we had progressives in both political parties. That ceases to be the case anymore. There were certainly Republican progressives like William Borah from Idaho, Robert McFollett from Wisconsin, and Democratic progressives, and Wheeler was foremost among them. Another thing that attracts me to Wheeler is my belief that he was a Senate institutionalist. And by that I mean he believed in the responsibility of a United States Senator and the Senate as an institution to provide a check on the executive branch of government. You think about what the Constitution says about the United States Senate. The Senate has particular responsibilities in our system. Approval of treaties, advise and consent on senior appointments to the judiciary and to other high positions in the federal government. Senators have a 6-year term, specifically to, at least in the theory of the founders, to insulate them a little bit from the hurly-burly of everyday politics. And Wheeler thought that that particular responsibility that accrues to a United States Senator was really something to defend, to uphold the prerogatives of the Senate. And throughout his career, he never wavered from dissenting against his own party. Mike Mansfield told me that, who was a contemporary in a way of Wheeler, said that Wheeler was mostly a Democrat, but he was always an independent. He was always willing to reject the direction that his political party was going, and he did it over and over during his career, sometimes at great peril to his own political standing here in Montana. But he was a real Senate institutionalist. By 1930, Wheeler is already endorsing Franklin Roosevelt to become president. The first member of the Senate to do so, even before Roosevelt had won a second term as governor of New York. This picture was taken in 1935. It's the signing ceremony of the Public Utilities Holding Company Act in 1935, a remarkable piece of legislation that Wheeler sponsored in the Senate, and Sam Rayburn, his counterpart in the House, future Speaker of the House, sponsored in the House of Representatives. This legislation broke up 13 massive utility holding companies that at that time dominated about 85 to 90% of all the electric utility generation and distribution in the country. It was a massive reordering of an entire segment of the American economy. Done, at least in Wheeler's view, because these utility holding companies were a great scheme to enrich a few people at the very top of the pyramid, of the holding company pyramid, while starving the operating companies, the real value that was owned by the holding companies at the level at which customers are served. So this piece of legislation passes in 1935. It's one of the examples of Wheeler's cooperation with the Roosevelt administration on major New Deal initiatives. And he did, for the most part, support the New Deal. He broke with Roosevelt over monetary policy in 1934. He opposed the National Recovery Act when it passed in 1933, which Roosevelt considered sort of the cornerstone of the New Deal. And Wheeler opposed it because he believed that it would encourage monopolistic practices, which had the courts allowed it to go into effect, it would have done, in my judgment, exactly that. So he was mostly a New Dealer, but he would pick and choose a little bit as to where he threw his complete support behind Roosevelt. The other guys in the picture here are Alvin Barkley, future Vice President of the United States, and future Senate Majority Leader. Barkley was on Wheeler's committee and was instrumental in the passage of the utility holding company legislation. These two guys on the far side over here, this is Tommy Corcoran, who was wrote one of Roosevelt's whiz kids, wrote a lot of the New Deal legislation and later became a very successful Washington lobbyist slash influence peddler. And this guy right here, Ben Cohen, was a real amazing amount of help to Wheeler in the creation of this utility holding company legislation. I devote a chapter in the book to the utility legislation because I think it was that important, and it's a fascinating political story where the nation's utility industry basically spent millions and millions of dollars on a lobbying effort to try to discredit Wheeler and Rayburn and the whole idea of providing some new way of approaching the organization of the American utility industry. Where Wheeler really broke with FDR is in 1937 over Roosevelt's plan to enlarge the Supreme Court. The president won a massive landslide re-election in 1936, one of the great political landslides in American political history. Carried all but two states, Vermont and Maine, prompting Jim Farley, who was Roosevelt's chief political advisor and campaign manager, to rewrite the old quip. The old quip used to be that so goes Maine, so goes the nation, Maine being a bellwether indicating which way the presidential election was going. After 1936, Farley said we'll have to cast that to so goes Maine, so goes Vermont. A very popular columnist at the time, Dorothy Thompson, wrote that if the campaign would have gone on for 2 weeks longer, Roosevelt would have carried Canada. So it was an enormous landslide, and with Roosevelt's election, he brings into the Congress an overwhelming Democratic majority. 76 Democrats in the Senate as the Senate convenes in 1937. The House majority was just as large. So Roosevelt believes, I can change the Supreme Court with this kind of Democratic majority. He's basically had his way with the Democratic Congress up to this point, has no reason to believe, at least in his own mind, that reforming, as he said, the court would be any different. But his proposal, which was hatched in complete secrecy and sprung on the Congress and the country, received immediate backlash, including from Wheeler. Roosevelt proposed in one fell swoop to add 6 new justices to the Supreme Court, increasing the size of the court from 9 members to 15. Everybody knew that these justices would be cast in Roosevelt's political frame, meaning that they would be liberal justices, they would support the New Deal legislation, and that essentially Roosevelt would in one fell swoop remake the federal judiciary. He also proposed appointing dozens of new federal judges in lower courts all over the country, and allowing those judges to roam from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So a new judge might be appointed in Montana, but he might be assigned to cases all over the country, something that Wheeler, because of his experience in Montana, rejected out of hand. But Roosevelt thinks, with this huge majority, I'm going to get this passed, no problem. And he expects the Democratic Congress to come smartly to attention and carry out his wishes. Wheeler has other ideas. He not only opposes the president's plan, he leads the opposition to the president's plan. So imagine the political courage that it takes to oppose arguably the most popular president since George Washington. Oppose a president of your own party at some considerable risk to his political standing here in Montana. Organized labor in Montana is very supportive of the president. They do snap smartly to attention, basically endorse his changes to the court. Jim Murray, Wheeler's counterpart in the Senate, is on board with Roosevelt's plan. Jerry O'Connell, the congressman from the 1st District, also a Butte guy, is on board with this. And this, Wheeler actually has to come home here to Butte during the debate over the consideration of Roosevelt's court packing to make one of what I think of as one of his best speeches, which he delivered at the School of Mines in front of a student audience. And he basically lays down his view about how the Constitution should operate, the importance of an independent judiciary, that the president, because he has such a partisan majority, cannot, on his own motion, remake the federal judiciary. Wheeler was not particularly supportive of the court's decisions as it related to a number of these New Deal initiatives, but he thought that Roosevelt basically was violating the idea of a separation of powers between the executive branch and the judiciary, that the executive branch was essentially going to take over the judiciary. So this creates a fair amount of controversy, and this guy, O'Connell, steps right into the middle of it. One writer at the time described him as a bald-headed bundle of left-wing tendencies. O'Connell had grown up here in Butte, went to Carroll College, got elected to the state legislature from Silverboe County at a very young age. I think he was 21 when he was elected to the legislature. Shortly after that, was elected to the State Public Service Commission, and then in 1936 runs for Congress and is elected to Congress, the youngest member of Congress at the time. And he is determined to make Wheeler pay for this opposition to Roosevelt's court packing. He starts making speeches all over his district and becoming a national figure in his own right, criticizing Wheeler's stand on the court. After Wheeler's position prevails on the court packing, Roosevelt loses this very, very high-profile initiative, the biggest defeat of Roosevelt's presidency, at least on a domestic political issue. O'Connell says, well, I'm going to gear up after my 1938 re-election so I can run against Wheeler in the Democratic primary in 1940 when Wheeler has to stand for re-election. And O'Connell strongly implies that the White House, Franklin Roosevelt, is behind his effort, that Roosevelt wants him to take on Wheeler, who O'Connell describes as increasingly a tool of the Anaconda Company, somebody who's lost his bearings as a progressive, as a liberal, and O'Connell's going to take him on. Wheeler has other ideas. First, he finds a candidate to run against O'Connell in the Democratic primary, a school superintendent from Helena by the name of Templeton. And Templeton is a political novice, never run for public office before. He actually does pretty well in the Democratic primary, but O'Connell wins that Democratic primary to take on this guy, Jacob Thorkelson. I want to read just one paragraph out of my book about Thorkelson. If I can find it quickly here. Well, I'll just tell you the story. Thorkelson was a physician. He had eventually settled in Butte, and he and a partner, true story, opened a nudist camp. Jerry O'Connell, who eventually runs against this guy in the general election of 1938, takes to saying of Thorkelson, I'm for the New Deal, not the nude deal. I speculate in the book that the nudist camp, I'm not quite sure where it was located in Butte, but it was not co-ed, if you know what I mean. It was separated, so there was a place for men, there was a place for women, and that may have been part of its demise. Had there been a little commingling, it might have been a more successful financial endeavor. Nonetheless, the nudist camp burned down under somewhat questionable circumstances. But Thorkelson, by hook or by crook, wins the Republican nomination to take on this seemingly well-entrenched Democratic incumbent who has completely identified with Franklin Roosevelt. The campaign gets pretty bitter, and pretty quickly gets bitter. Thorkelson's campaign is essentially managed by a guy named Ed Craney, who is very close to Wheeler, a pioneer broadcaster in Montana, and really a national figure as a broadcast pioneer. Craney, in his papers at the Montana Historical Society, there's a copy of a memo that he writes to Thorkelson about how he should conduct his campaign, the issues he should run on, who he should meet, where he's going to raise money to take on the Democratic incumbent. And indeed, he does beat O'Connell. On November 8th, 1938, Montana experienced one of the biggest political upsets in the state's history. The virtually unknown Republican congressional candidate, a one-time nudist colony operator from Butte, defeated an incumbent Democratic congressman who enjoyed the backing of a popular president and who nearly everyone believed was just beginning a long political career. It was a stunning reversal of fortune for Jerry O'Connell and effectively removed him as a future threat to Wheeler. 2 years after O'Connell had carried each one of the 17 counties in Montana's first congressional district, but in 1938 he lost 13 of those counties. O'Connell did manage to carry Silverbow County in his home base of Butte, but the percentage of the vote he received in the Organized Labor Center of Montana fell dramatically. 69% that he polled in 1936, just 54% against Thorkelson. Nearly everywhere else in his district, O'Connell's margin from 2 years earlier was reversed. And Wheeler was largely responsible for this. He saw O'Connell as a threat to him in 1940, so he was going to take care of him in 1938, and he really did. He put his own political organization to work. He did not publicly endorse Thorkelson. He certainly did not publicly endorse O'Connell, but he worked quietly behind the scenes against him, and so did Mrs. Wheeler. She took to the road with a friend of hers, meeting with women's church groups all over western Montana, where they would have, a coffee or a tea with the church group, and you can almost imagine her talking about O'Connell, who was a Catholic, but a divorced Catholic, so he was at odds with the Catholic Church. I document in the book Wheeler's contacts with the Catholic bishop in Helena, who actively worked against O'Connell's re-election. So Wheeler, who one reporter described in the early 1940s as the most likable man in the Senate, and there are numerous accounts of what a charming guy he was, what a decent fellow he was, but he could also play real political hardball, and he certainly did in 1938. He also played real political hardball with the other senator from Butte, Jim Murray. Murray is elected in 1934 in a remarkable coincidence, I guess, or a circumstance that rarely repeats itself in American politics. Both of Montana's senators in 1934 were on the ballot in the same year. Murray was running to fill out the unexpired term of Tom Walsh, who had died in office, and he wins the Democratic primary against former Governor John Erickson, who had essentially engineered his own appointment to the Senate. He resigned so that the Lieutenant Governor, Mike Cooney, could appoint him to the Senate. It was said that it took 11 minutes from Erickson's resignation until Cooney appointed him to the Senate. But Erickson has to stand for re-election almost immediately in 1934, and Murray, who's a prominent attorney here in Butte, very wealthy guy, very strong ties to organized labor, very much a Roosevelt Democrat, runs against Erickson and defeats him in that 1934 campaign. And it's this campaign, I believe, that sows the seeds of the feud between Wheeler and Murray that really lasts for the rest of their lives. A Senate historian told me some years ago that there's no relationship in politics that is more complicated than that between two senators from the same state. These two guys are two senators from the same state, also from the same party, and I think it's fair to say that they really came to detest each other. One of the reasons that Wheeler didn't want Murray on the ballot in 1934 is he didn't want all of the political leadership of the state of Montana to come from Butte. He thought that was a long-term prescription for trouble for the Democratic Party. In fact, the Republican Party chairman in 1934 quipped that to read the Democratic ticket on the ballot that year, all you had to do was browse the Butte telephone directory. But Murray does get elected to the Senate, and Wheeler essentially spends the rest of his career trying to make sure that Murray doesn't return to the Senate, and Murray returns the favor. When Murray runs for re-election in 1942, Wheeler comes extremely close to openly supporting Wellington Rankin, Jeanette Rankin's brother, who's the Republican candidate. Murray eventually won that election by about 2,000 votes. In 1946, when Wheeler is finally defeated in the Democratic primary, Murray is openly helping Wheeler's Democratic opponent. So there have been some cases in American politics where two senators from the same state had this kind of head-knocking relationship, but this one is almost in a class by itself, I think. And both of these guys were from Butte. Murray's ties to the Irish community in Butte were deep and broad. He was a big supporter of the Irish Republican movement and made a lot of hay, if you will, from a political standpoint because of that relationship. I want to say speak just for a moment about Lulu Weaver. I mentioned to the woman in the back who's working on her knitting that I had a picture of Lulu working on her knitting. This was taken in 1937 when she is sitting in the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room waiting for her husband to offer his testimony on Roosevelt's court packing legislation. And the Washington Post reporter made note of the fact that these women showed up for the hearing, but obviously were listening to what was going on, but were still concentrating on their knitting. She was an enormously important part of his political life. They married, I believe it was 1908. They moved to that house that Kim referenced on 2nd Street at about that time, bought that house and moved in at about that time. Mrs. Wheeler Lulu had basically told BK that he needed to get himself established as a lawyer, start making a dependable income, which after a few years working here in Butte, he was able to do. He went back to Illinois, they got married, and he brought her out to Butte, Montana. I think it's safe to say she was not in love with Butte, probably from the first minute. Kind of a strange environment for somebody who grew up in the flatlands of Illinois. And when Wheeler loses re-election in 1946, I don't think there was any discussion about them coming back to Montana. They were going to stay in Washington, D.C. But as I said, she was a very important aspect of his political career. His chief advisor, quite a bit more conservative than the senator in her own political views. She was very involved in the America First Committee movement prior to World War II, served on the National Board of America First, was the treasurer of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the America First Committee. She didn't like Jim Murray. I quote in the book, when they're campaigning together in 1934 over in eastern Montana, Lulu writes to one of their daughters, Elizabeth, that, well, we've been with the Murrays again, and it's quite a load to carry these people around. She was very dismissive of Jim Murray's speaking style. By most accounts, he was not a great public speaker, and Lulu thought BK, of course, was the cat's meow when it came to giving a political stump speech. So she's very critical of Murray's intellect, very critical of his speaking ability. And she was very critical of Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt took to referring to her as Lady Macbeth, the woman sort of behind the scenes manipulating the senator. But she was a very, very important part of his career. There's the house. So they had some other ties to Butte other than the political ties. They obviously owned real estate here. I'm not quite sure when the house was sold. I mentioned to the gentleman who asked me before we began today that I think it must have been about the time that they went to Washington the first time in late in 1922, early in 1923. But the house is on the National Register of Historic Places. And Wheeler owned the Grand Hotel, and it provided a nice supplement to his congressional salary for as long as he owned the hotel here. So lots of ties to Butte, Montana, a political hellraiser of the first order, a true maverick. I've been asked a number of times while I've been touring around Montana and Idaho talking about this story, is there anybody in the Senate today who reminds me of BK Wheeler? And my answer is no, for a couple of reasons. One is his remarkable independence. That idea that he's always identified as a Democrat, but he was always willing, at least in his own view, to put his country ahead of his party, to oppose a president of his own party, which he did repeatedly, to be a Senate institutionalist, to stand up for the prerogatives of the Senate against public pressure to do things that the President of the United States might want the Senate to do. So he is really an unusual character in our politics, at least as we look through the lens of our politics today. I guess the other thing I would say in closing, and be happy to take your questions, is that we could use a little more bipartisanship of the kind that Wheeler practiced, I think. He endorsed on many occasions, publicly endorsed Republican members of the Senate for re-election. He endorsed young Bob La Follette in 1928, actually left the campaign trail here in Montana in his own re-election to travel to Wisconsin to speak in favor of La Follette, a Republican, being elected to the Senate. He endorsed Senator Burton in Idaho, a prominent Republican. He endorsed Charles McNary in Oregon, who went on to become the Senate Minority Leader and run for Vice President in 1940 on the Republican ticket. So he had these political relationships all across the political spectrum. He said he voted for Norman Thomas for president in 1940. Norman Thomas, the leader of the American Socialist Party. And he carried on a correspondence with Norman Thomas for years while both of them were active in American politics. So a remarkable degree of political relationships. Harry Truman was one of his best friends in the Senate. He was on very good terms with Huey Long, the notorious senator from Louisiana, who was a frequent guest in the Wheeler home for dinner. So a remarkable degree of political independence, a willingness to work across the political aisle on all sorts of things. My wife says I should come up with a good analogy today to describe how unusual it would be if there was a B.K. Wheeler in the Senate today. And so I come up with this, let's see, it would be something like Lindsey Graham endorsing Elizabeth Warren. I mean, it's unthinkable. And one of the things that was different in Wheeler's day from our day is that you really did have liberals in the Republican Party or progressives in the Republican Party. You had conservatives in the Democratic Party. So there was a range of political ideologies in both of the major parties. Now we basically sorted into the tribes of, the left wing of the Democratic Party, the right wing of the Republican Party, and the middle has virtually disappeared. Well, Wheeler often operated in that middle, even though on many things he was very liberal. He once advocated nationalizing the railroads, for example. He had his own plan to reform the Supreme Court at one point during his 1924 run for vice president on the Progressive Party ticket, which I didn't even mention. So remarkable independence, a remarkable Senate institutionalist, somebody with bipartisan relationships. In many ways, I think a model of how a United States Senator could operate and once did operate. So great to see all of you here today. I'd be delighted to try to respond to some questions. And I'm going to ask my friend here to sing the Burton K. Wheeler fight song. All right.